Hi, everyone. Chris, we are here recording this just a couple days after Sunday, the Sunday that we had the worship night.
The day of Pentecost.
The day of Pentecost.
Yeah.
That very important Sunday.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found myself reflecting on what a beautiful evening that was in the life of our church.
Yeah.
It was, before we get to the beautiful, it was the hottest, warmest, maybe the warmest experience I've ever had leading worship. And there's some debate about where the hottest place was in the whole room. The balcony, there was some complaining.
Yeah.
And on the stage, it was also very warm, but people were there for it. And I was just so impacted. I think it was 350 people in the room and people in the lobby, and 2 hours of heartfelt pursuit after God and awaiting on his presence and just praising who he is. And I was just so impacted by the hunger for God in our church and just what the Spirit's doing. And this does not always happen, but I feel like I can't even I often can't catch up to texts, but right now I can't catch up to texts of testimonies of people who are like, God met me in this way. This is how I experienced the power of the Spirit working in my life. And it's just so encouraging and so evident that way beyond anything we're doing or orchestrating, God's at work in our community.
Sometimes I'm jealous about all the text messages you get of good reports.
Yeah.
I was away with my family in Whistler, and the place we were staying, it had like a mini sauna. And I went in that sauna I was thinking about West Point Grey.
That's a really cool way to associate with our experience that we were having. And you're often, you've missed a few of these nights.
Yeah, some of the best days in the life of the church I'm not there for.
You and Jace spoke this weekend, which there was a day in my life when I dreamt about being part of a community when Jace and Chris would both speak on a weekend.
Okay.
So that happened,
right.
And it was a treat for all of us. What did you talk about for anyone who might have missed it?
Well, we're back in our series talking about why we do what we do when we gather on a Sunday. And this past Sunday, we talked about why we invite people to give most Sundays, almost every Sunday these days. And it's made me reflect on my journey, because I grew up in the church, but I wasn't a follower of Jesus. And all the things we're talking about in this series are things that I hated to do.
Right.
I did not like going to church. I was dragged there. I did not like singing songs to Jesus. Weird. I didn't want to read my Bible ever. And then I definitely didn't want to give any of my money to the church.
How did it work when you were growing up? Was there like an offering plate?
Yeah, they would pass an offering plate. Now, here's what's crazy. This is what happened to me. When I was like 20, I became a follower of Jesus. All of a sudden, my desires started to change. So all of a sudden, I liked gathering. I liked going to church. I would look for extra opportunities to go to church.
Right.
I started to like reading the Bible, even though I didn't understand a lot of it. I started to like singing songs to Jesus. I learned guitar so I could sing songs to Jesus on my own. But they would pass the plate, and I wouldn't put anything into it, as long as I didn't take anything out.
That was progress.
It was progress for me. And so but I didn't feel guilty about it. I'm just like, there's an offering here.
Yeah.
But there came a point, no pressure, no compulsion, no one pulled me aside, where I just felt like, I should give to the church. And so I started doing that. And because I'd spent so much of my life to that point taking, it felt like such a transformative, powerful act to give. And then someone pulled me aside or I asked, how much should I give? And someone probably said 10%. So I started doing that and kind of saw that as the floor, not the ceiling, and just wanting to grow in generosity. So my experience with the topic from this past Sunday has actually been very positive. But that's not everyone's story. This conversation can be littered with landmines, and we address some of that.
Yes, and I didn't have an upbringing where that was problematic. My parents were pastors, and they still pastor this beautiful community church in Maple Ridge, and they just always handled that topic well with us. But I remember for me, it was moments in my early 20s just asking questions like, why money to the church, and why this amount, and just trying to ask some of those deeper questions. But fortunately, I had really good, wise people who weren't weird about it and who helped me see the different perspectives. And so that helped me. And one of the reasons why we're doing this series is to help with those types of questions that would come, like, why this? Why is this highlighted? What are you really asking? And so what did you guys say to that?
Well, I mean, we talked about a bunch of things. Like we kind of went through even the story of Scripture, Old Testament, New Testament, the call to generosity, the call to giving. We talked about the tithe in the Old Testament.
Right.
We talked about the call to generosity, the radical nature of it in the New Testament. We talked a bit about this idea of where your treasure is, your heart will also be. And this reality that Jesus talked a surprising amount about wealth and money. A lot of his parables are about it, and no real apprenticeship to Jesus can be deep and authentic without wrestling with how our faith and his lordship in our lives connects to our wealth and to generosity. And so we talked about that, and I think, that's probably a passage you'll read tonight. And I also, we haven't talked about it yet as we record this, so I might say something like, when God invites us to give, he's not just asking for something from us. He's giving something to us. That there's such a gift and a freedom and a joy that comes from generosity and partnering with God in our finances. I think I'm going to say something like that, but I'll say it better.
But it sounded real good.
Did it?
Yeah.
And so I always have loved the story of Jesus and this widow who gives to the treasury at the temple, and it says all she had to live on. And Jesus goes, I tell you the truth, this woman gave more than all these rich people who were putting in large amounts. And I'm always like, he goes, she gave more. That's so weird, because from like a technical accounting perspective, she didn't give more money.
Right.
So more to Jesus can't be about amount of money you give. It's about the amount of trust or love or faith that you're giving exemplifies. And you can't put a percentage on that. And that's a beautiful example of her partnering with God in her finances and trusting him to meet her needs.
Yeah, it makes me think about how we often say something like, this is between, we say things like, it's between you and God. But I think in my own life, like how often giving has just become something I do, and I miss out when I don't do it as an act of faith towards him. And that again, like everything else, is what blesses his heart as we step out towards him, in love towards him. Chris, we've talked a bit about this, but what we'd love for you to chat about in small groups is to really have a conversation. There's a lot of, we shared our experiences. They're fairly positive. Like Chris said, there's probably lots of negative experiences with this whole money conversation. So we'd love for you, in a way that your small group pastor or discussion leader will direct, to have a conversation about all this, money, giving, things Scripture says about it. In this series, we've been doing some pretty unique things in small groups. One of the things we'd love for you to do at some point in the evening is to create some space with music in the background, just for you to take personal time to reflect on your own heart and your money and what it means for you to step out in faith in that area before the Lord. Anything else that you'd want to pass on to our friends before we fully pass it off?
No, other than to say, like, money's a good servant but a terrible master, and one of the ways we get it out of our hearts is to give it out of our hands. And there is really deep and profound joy on the other side of generosity and partnering with God in our finances. So I always feel on this topic like nervous because of the landmines and bad experiences, but I also feel like I'm actually fighting for people's joy.
So cool.
Because that's on the other side of this. Yeah. So that's
amazing.
All I've got to say.
I'm really glad that I didn't just end it, but that I said, do you have anything else you want to say?
Right. Cool.
Because that was great. We'll talk real soon.
What's the timing on that? Oh my goodness, 9.5, dude.